Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers. I had a chance to visit more ancient mound sites as I was traveling. I visited 4 mounds. One was called Angel Mounds in Evansville, Indiana, the other in Vincennes, Indiana, and a smaller mound in Cincinnati called Northwood Mound. Also, there are a few mounds where I actually grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa as well, but I just found out about this last year by my neighbors. In each of these cases, there are some suspicions that there's some major tampering going on by state-sponsored archaeologists. Angel Mounds is one of those cases. It was the most impressive mound that I visited recently, named after the 18th century owners of the land at the time. With 600 acres, this site was situated on the Ohio River. It was a large residential and agricultural community with possibly over a few thousand people living within the fortified walled town, inhabited possibly all the way up to the 1450s. So it's possible that colonial explorers may have traveled down the Ohio River and ran across this town, and they could have been the catalyst of its downfall, although many mainstream archaeologists think this is unlikely. But they do admit that the town was completely abandoned in the 15th century and parts destroyed. So it's possible there was a major encounter here, similar to like what happened at Tenochtitlan. Now, the mound today is not totally original because it was actually taken apart in 1938 to 1945, financed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. The Workers' Projects Administration actually employed over 250 workers under the direction of Indiana archaeologist Glenn A. Black to excavate 120,000 square feet of the site. These efforts resulted in recording and processing over 2 million archaeological items. This is the time that state-sponsored archaeologists were heavily digging up mounds all over the US for the federal government through the Civilian Conservation Corps. Most of these 2 million artifacts are not to be seen in the museum. So if there were any 8-foot tall Nephilims found in these mounds, they're probably hidden away and marked as classified archaeological artifacts, probably locked away at some military base. For there was a race between the Nazis and Americans to find evidence of this so-called Aryan race, remnants of the original Atlanteans of Egypt that may have migrated to the Americas around 3000 BC that helped kickstart civilization here, with the Mississippi mound builders and the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas. But at least they were nice enough to put the soil back. Now, Mound A is about 44 feet tall. More than likely it was taller at around 1000 AD, it was probably more like 50 feet tall. For the goal of the chieftains at the time was to build a mound at least to the height of the treetops or slightly higher. The mounds were not just ceremonial, but they were used as military observation towers in some sense, for the town was a fortified settlement, just as Cahokia was a fortified city of over 30,000 people. So this is an example of their walls that they would have put around the whole city. So the whole idea of a walled city and enforcement, even the Native Americans did this. It probably looked a lot better than actually this recreation, to be honest. They probably even colored it with different kind of dyes. It might have been even taller. And they probably had bow and arrows, and they would defend their little city-state. Just like Atlantis was probably ringed around by a wall. So this gives you an idea. And this probably doesn't do it justice, but this whole area here, there's the mound, there might have been more mounds, or might have been taller, would have had huts all over here at one time, an enclosed settlement. The next mound I visited is in the town of Vincennes, which was named the Sugarloaf Mound. There's also one in St. Louis actually called that. There's a lot of mounds called Sugarloaf for some reason. But this is actually a large mound I'd never heard of. So I had to check with the YouTuber Chuck of Apps to see if he had made a video, and sure enough he did. God rest his soul. So the mound is a conical platform mound, and it may have had a hut on top where the village elders or chieftains gathered together to govern the town, which may have had a few hundred people. Sure enough, this tribe traded with the larger settlement at Angel Mounds. This mound is now part of a public park. Although residence neighborhoods have been built around it, it is now about 44 feet from the base, This is similar to what is seen at the Adena Mound in Dayton, Ohio, which I also have visited. Clearly there looks like evidence of sculpting of the landscape to raise the ground another 15 or so feet from its original grade. The small park now sits on the platform, which most likely hosted the elites of the village that had huts on this platform. The main mound appears to have been built into the side of a bluff, creating only one large downhill side, pictured here, where the other side collapsed and eroded, off where the trees are growing. Some thought it was a natural feature like wind-blown silt deposits caused by loose hills, which is seen in western Iowa, but those are not common in this area, although the soil type is similar, but the context of the rest of the typology in the area doesn't really fit it. So the mound is sometimes referred to as an intrusive burial. The mound dates to at least 1000 AD for its last major occupation as a burial site. Sugarloaf has a base of 216 feet from the east to west and 118 feet from north to south. But the back side looks like it's collapsed or was excavated a long time ago. Vincent and the rest of the Knox County once held a large concentration of mound builder architectural structures within the state of Indiana. Most were destroyed due to agriculture and erecting modern Vincent itself. Although only a few of more than 200 mounds that used to populate Knox County still exist, and this is one of the largest ones in the state. Although not much research has been done on this mound. This image appears in page 81 of the 1937 book of Prehistoric Antiquities of Indiana by Eli Lilly. Again, it was in the late 1930s that some suspicious activity was happening with these mounds. The next mound I visited is in Cincinnati, Ohio, called Norwood Mound. This burial mound was roughly 100 by 130 feet in diameter and 16 feet high. It originally was believed to have been taller and wider before the road was ringed around it. It's located within the town of Norwood's Water Tower Park at 656 feet above sea level. The mound is at the highest land elevation in Norwood and one of the highest elevations in southwest Ohio. The size and shape and location of the mound suggest that it was constructed by the people of the Adena culture during the pre-Columbian era, putting its date to as old as 500 BC. Archaeologists believe that the mound was used by the Adenas for religious ceremonies and as a smoke signaling, for many Mississippian mounds were located at high bluffs overlooking their settlement down in the floodplain regions near the river. It's also possible that some Adena mounds were originally used as earthen shelters for the chieftains, while the average citizen in the tribe lived in thatched huts in the low-lying areas. These earthen shelters were probably mainly supported by wood beams, with a few utilizing stone. Below the earth shelters, pits would have been dug below the base of the mound to place their deceased leaders, possibly 10 feet or more below the base of the mound. Baskets would have been used to remove the soil out of the shelter and place it back when they were done burying their deceased. So these mounds acted not just as a burial mound, but also as a gathering space for their tribal council meetings, consisting of warriors to shamans and their chiefs. The room would have been small, but large enough for a few tribal members to gather together during the winter times especially. A hole was probably cut out of the shelter's top of the mound so smoke can get out. If the village was about to be abandoned, the earthen burial shelter may have been converted back to just being a burial mound, so it may have originally been more of an earthen igloo. In 1895, sources describe it as the only Indian mound now remaining in the vicinity of Cincinnati. There are mounds in downtown Cincinnati as well at the time when the early settlers arrived, but not much research has been done on these since many were destroyed because a lot of them were lying in the low-lying areas near the floodplain, an area that was perfect for settlement. So it's possible a few of these smaller mounds on top of the bluffs may still consist of those original giant mutant humans if the government had not gotten to them by this time. Now this leads me to an interesting story that my neighbor was telling me about some small burial mounds in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. An older neighbor of mine named Ron that lived in the area for over 50 years claims that on Thanksgiving night some people with an excavator came out and dug up these mounds in the 1970s. They are only about 5 to 6 feet tall and 30 feet wide. He claims they took artifacts out of the mounds and placed the soil back. These mounds were suspected to be known since the 1950s. He didn't know if it was done by looters or by state archaeologists under the cover of night and a holiday. This was on top of the hill from where he was living. At the time, the hill was not part of his property, but one of his relatives later owned it and was raising cattle near the mounds. The only place that has any record of these mounds is at Iowa State Archaeological Office in Iowa City. It was the state archaeologists that actually put a halt on construction of a high-end residential neighborhood by the Statler Real Estate. Statler was ordered to redesign the neighborhood around 5 small mounds. He was told to demarcate the mounds with some boulders, but not to name the neighborhood as Cedar Mound Ridge, but to instead simply call it Cedar Bluff Ridge, in order to keep the mounds relatively secret to the public. Only those in the neighborhood were told about the mounds when they moved in, but it was kept low profile. It's possible that these mounds were once more like an effigy mound like we see in northeast Iowa. And I think these effigy woodland mounds at one time may have actually had a wow cover over them, possibly dawny phlox in shaded areas and a pink evening primrose for the sunny areas, especially in the southern mound builders. Women would have maintained the flowers of the mound like a garden, burning weeds and reseeding and transplanting. I think this tradition was lost by the mound builders. So if you ever have a chance to visit any of these mounds, take the time to sprinkle some phlox on them or maybe some primrose. I want people to know about these mounds, and I think the neighborhood also needs to be renamed to Cedar Mound Ridge to give honor to the original settlers of this hilltop, who were the Oneota Indians. Now there's a valley called Seminole Valley named after the Seminole Indians who were forced to migrate to Iowa. It's possible that this valley may have consisted of a small mound builder settlement, and the mounds were placed above the valley overlooking the settlement. And I think this village may have consisted of long houses or even plank houses and possibly earth lodges. We tend to associate these type of architectural structures to one type of tribe, but I think over 500 BC these structures were originally invented by the mound builders, but later was disseminated out to the west coast and the east coast. I think many of these structures were not just destroyed by natural means or by the Europeans, but also by the Native Americans themselves. This site probably also acted as a fire signal hilltop for those trading on the Cedar River, the highway of its time. We tend to focus on the big mounds, but there are a lot of small mounds that may not have been completely excavated, but at the same time even they are not totally immune to being tampered with, in order to seek the enigma of the legends on the lost mutant human race of 7 to 8 feet tall with 6 fingers and 6 toes and possibly elongated skulls. What we call the Titans, the Nephilim, the Aryans, the Anunnaki, and the Atlanteans. Remnants of their ancestors may have found their way to Neo-Atlantica some 3000 BCE. Well, this has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas and check out these mounds when you got a chance.
Enigma depravatio